Oh my gosh.
I might be mixing it up, but like, I'm pretty sure we talked a lot about like this moment as people's first memory.
Okay.
No, for sure. This one has been so.
Okay, everyone, just a slight adjustment to the schedule. We're supposed to be on spatial cognition today. I'm a little bit behind, but I'll catch up. I promise. So we're still talking about memory today. And I want to pick up on where we left off last time, which was talking about this robust phenomenon of infantile or childhood amnesia. I keep saying infantile or childhood because it's referred to in these two ways in the literature. It means the same thing. Wherein people have a great deal of difficulty remembering things prior to about 3 or 4 years of age, right? Their first memories seem to happen only at about 3 or 4 years of age. That's the sort of general finding. Now, why would that be? We were talking about some possibilities last time informally. I want to go through them today a little bit more formally because we do have a better understanding today than we did in the past about why there's this so-called amnesia, right? It's not the idea that Freud originally proposed related to, you repress horrible childhood memories, and that's why they're lost, right? That everything that happened early on would have been difficult to deal with, and so they've been repressed. We know that can't be true because that's not likely for everyone, right? We also know it can't be true because some of these earliest memories were those negative events, right? The very sad, scary first day at school and things like that, right? So it's not that all negative things are getting repressed in the way that Freud originally proposed. Okay, so what are some of the possible explanations? So one possibility, which I think some people were somewhat sympathetic to, which is that memory formation doesn't start that early, right? That babies are living kind of in the here and now and not forming long-term memories. Okay, so that's possibility one. The idea being that if you didn't encode it, then there's nothing to remember it later on, right? So this possibility really focuses on one of those processing levels that we talked about before when it comes to getting to memories, which is the initial encoding part of it, that these long-term memories aren't even being encoded for later retrieval. Okay. This also came up, again, kind of informally, that infants may have some memories, though not all types of memories. And so the ones we're trying to access when we talk about our first memories are the ones that they didn't form. That doesn't mean they're totally oblivious, right? They don't have anterograde amnesia, so that they're not forming any memories. They may be forming some, though not all. And the idea here is that some of those are the ones that they don't have access to. One possibility in particular, I'm actually using the language that you guys used last time, is that there's a potential difference between sort of the implicit and the explicit memories. Maybe babies only have memories that are kind of implicit in nature. They don't form the explicit ones. Okay, we'll see more about that in a bit. Okay, here's a somewhat related possibility. It's not totally mutual exclusive to possibility two. It's that infants, again, do form memories, but this time there's a mismatch in encoding, right? This is the idea that infants are forming different types of memories, but the way they encode that information early on is not how we typically encode it later, and so you have difficulty retrieving it. So the idea is that they're there, but you can't have access to them, right? I've used the example before about kind of a mismatch in sort of software, for example, right? If you had originally saved something in a really old version of Word, and then you have a new computer, there are cases where the newer system can't get access to it, right? It can't read it. There's an incompatibility there. So that's the idea here, is that maybe, particularly because babies are pre-linguistic, right? They don't even have language, that those memories reside in that kind of format, which is very different from what happens when we start talking and using language to help us encode and remember things. Yeah.
So in this case, like they would encode, for example, like a fact in their like implicit memory. So in that case, like they know it. They wouldn't remember it because it's not like in an explicit form.
They might remember it while they're still children, right? Because the type of encoding remains the same, right? So if you asked maybe, the idea was if you asked a 3-year-old to remember something that they experienced earlier on, they might be able to tell you then, but they can't tell you as an adult because now the type of encoding has completely changed, right? That would be the idea. And one possibility, again, is the difference in language and the role that language plays when forming memories.
So at what age does infantile amnesia start happening? Because if you're 4 years old and you can remember things from when you were 2, but then you can't when you're an adult, when does that happen?
Yeah, we'll go through some of this, right? Okay. We'll think about some paradigms that allow us to tease this apart a little bit. When we're showing infantile amnesia or childhood amnesia and saying we don't have memories for things prior to 3 or 4 years of age, these are adults being asked these questions, right? Adolescents being asked these questions. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm a little bit confused, but when you talk about mismatch, does it mean encoding being updated because they grow up, or is it the retrieval that's updated?
No, it's the encoding that has changed in this case, right? Meaning that, so suppose you're dealing with a pre-verbal mind, right, to begin with. And we know that pre-verbal mind, right? We know that they represent certain things and that they seem to know certain things related to faces, right, to objects and things like that. We know that the format of those representations can't be linguistic at all, right, because they don't have language. Not that we'd expect them to be linguistic, given that they are perceptual in nature, but there aren't any cases in which they can be linguistic. Language isn't there. This becomes especially relevant when talking about episodic memories. Remember, episodic memories are the things that pertain to your own life. And people have shown that episodic memories are really kind of narrative, that people have memories of their birthday parties, for example, or some fun outing that they talk a lot about, and they tend to form a kind of script in their minds. So this is an example of a type of memory that seems to be highly dependent on things like language and talking and scripts, and others that may be completely not dependent on language, right? So the idea here would be, again, you're encoding, you have different types of codes depending on your developmental stage. And when one becomes more sophisticated, like the language-based one, and that's what you're using mostly, you can't then retrieve the ones that weren't sort of linguistic in nature. That's the idea, the mismatch in encoding. Yeah?
By that idea, if you spontaneously gave a rat the ability to speak, would it then not be able to retrieve any of its memories?
Well, if you can do that, let's talk about that. No, I'm kidding. That would be the idea. If the later memories become very dependent on that kind of symbolic system. And this is not crazy because, again, the episodic ones we have shown are very language related. There are people, one person in particular who was here for many years, Robin Fidish, who did all of this narrative work showing how the extent to which you elaborate, the types of language you use, are predictive of the kinds of episodic memories you have, right? So at least in that case, we know it's very linguistic in nature. And so if you're using your very linguistic type of episodic memory, as an adult to try to retrieve the earlier ones, you're not gonna have any luck because the format of those representations are incompatible, right? That's the sort of claim being made here as a possibility. Okay, any other questions? Okay, so let's talk about possibility one. The idea that maybe infants don't form any memories whatsoever. They're amnesic. What's the evidence against this possibility? Any ideas? Yeah.
I don't know if this is what you know, but last week we distinguished between like procedural memory, which is like infants are learning how to do things and
Like what?
like discriminate objects, for
Mhm.
example, other skills we've talked about.
Whether or not that's procedural, there is a paradigm that we use to test whether they can discriminate objects and that sort of thing, right? So let me just start with this one because habituation dishabituation is based on the premise that there's going to be a memory for something that has to last at least a few minutes, right? And that's already getting past sort of working memory, right? Which is much shorter. So the fact that a baby will discriminate an object, that's novel during test. The fact that a baby would have been habituated, let's say, to a circle, and then looks longer at a square compared to a circle means they remembered the circle, right? Remember that this paradigm is sequential in nature. This is not paired presentation. They're not being shown circle versus square. We're not testing them in the immediate, whether you can discriminate those two. We're saying, can you discriminate circle versus square after having seen circle and not currently seeing it? So we were talking about that in terms of representation, right? Encoding. But here we can say, it's clearly related to memory because you're also able to retrieve that information to then do this comparison, right? The only way to look longer during novel, again, is based on the premise that you remember the previous stimulus. So there's some memory happening here. Now, we could call this longish term because we don't think it's happening in working memory. We don't think that, remember, working memory is the sort of active memory we have where there's rehearsal. We don't necessarily think that's what's happening with the babies. We have no evidence that that's what's happening. We're thinking it's made its way into a longish term memory that can last several minutes, if not longer. In some cases, they do test babies on habituation, dishabituation with a longer lag. And so again, there's some memory there, right? So that's one example, at least based on the studies you've learned about, that suggests they can't be amnesics, right? They are they are forming some memory. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
They remember their caregivers,
Mm-hmm.
so like they can recognize that it's their mom or their dad, and that's like long-term memory, I think.
That's right. And here, I'm not showing you that paradigm, but in the preferential looking paradigm, where a baby might prefer their mother compared to another woman, right? That again is based on the premise that there's familiarity there, that you brought some familiarity that now affects your preferences. That wouldn't happen, right, unless there was a memory for the mother or father caregiver or whatever. The idea that we're showing these effects in very young babies, remember, within the first month, babies start to show a preference for their caregiver, even when matched for another person's face gender, right? So they will prefer their mother over another woman matched for attractiveness and all that sort of thing, right? Again, that suggests that they are forming a memory of their mother in that case, or father, the caregiver, the father's the primary caregiver. Not out of sight, out of mind, right? And clearly there is permanence there. Okay. Last class I also talked about this particular paradigm where the baby chooses the helper more than the hinderer in the early morality studies, right? you can only make a consistent choice if you remember who the helper and hinderer were, right? Again, these are, you know, anywhere from, they were starting as young as 3-month-old babies. Obviously, they were going into older babies as well for other paradigms related to this. But this is actually an arbitrary event that the baby comes to the lab to experience, right? This isn't, these characters aren't especially meaningful to the babies, and yet, because they paid attention to what was happening, and presumably made the discrimination between the good guy and the bad guy, they can only consistently pick the good guy if they remember who the good guy was, right? So again, some memory has to be there. In these examples, not really long-term memory, but clearly some form of long-term memory present from within the first year of life. So we can rule out the idea that babies are totally amnesic, right? They're starting to form memories. Thank goodness, right? Would make life hard if they weren't. Okay, here's another paradigm that gets used quite a bit and has been used quite a bit over the last few decades to test babies' memory for, again, relatively arbitrary events. And what was nice is that this kind of reinforcement paradigm has been used across babies of different ages. They've done longitudinal work to see how long they can maintain these arbitrary memories. I'll show you what the task looks like. So there's this baseline measurement where the baby comes into the lab. Is this playing? Okay. So the lab is a crib with this, little contraption up top. And what they've done is in that baseline phase, is it doesn't move, right? The mobile doesn't move, but the baby has a ribbon attached to its leg. But initially, the ribbon is attached to the crib and not the toy, okay? So even when the baby moves, there's a ribbon there, and nothing happens, right? The ribbon moves, the toy stays stable, right? And they're just getting the baby used to the environment, this new toy and this new environment. Okay, then comes the learning phase. In the learning phase, they tie the ribbon now to the toy, to the mobile that's above. So now when the baby kicks, it moves, okay? And babies like it, right? They like it if you move it too, but here's a case where they can move it, and they'll kick over and over again, right? Okay. Simple experiment, novel environment, kind of arbitrary, but again, an interesting environment that the baby is motivated to learn about because it's a fun toy above their head, right? Okay. So the overall procedure is such that, like I said, there's the baseline phase where you just measure number of kicks. When babies are on their back like this, they will kick occasionally, right? They're not perfectly still. They'll kick occasionally. So, you collect an average number of kicking. Let's say it's 5 kicks, within like 10 minutes or within a 15-minute period. Then in the reinforcement phase, you tie the ribbon to the apparatus up top. And as they learn, you see that kicking increases. It increases significantly because, again, they like this toy. This is a fun thing for them to do. It's fun not only because it moves, but we also think it's fun because babies are experiencing some agency, which they enjoy from early in life, right? Having control over something, which is satisfying for them. Here's the key for the memory test. Then there's some delay. They take the baby away. Maybe the baby goes home and comes back sometime later to the lab to do this experiment again. When they bring the baby back for the first time, lay them in the crib, how much do they kick? And this time they're going to do it so that the ribbon is not tied to the apparatus, it's tied again to the crib. So kicking won't move it. So there's no immediate reinforcement. But the amount of kicking they do will tell you how much they remember the environment. There's no reason to kick, more than what did we say the average was initially, for example, 5 times. There's no reason to kick more than that unless you have a memory of what this ribbon does when you're in this environment. And you find that young babies learn this when they come back to the lab. They do engage in more kicking relative to baseline. This is always very significant. But then the question is, does it vary? Right? Does it depend on the length of the delay? Does it depend on the age of the baby? Yes, both. And what this shows you, these data across many studies, is that even at 9 months for a completely arbitrary event, a fun event, but not something that is meaningful in terms of interacting with a human, or their family, the memory lasts a month. So you can bring a 9-month-old after that brief encounter a month later, and they will remember the apparatus in this lab, and they'll start kicking much more than they would have at baseline. So by 9 months, again, you're getting kind of impressive memory. A month later for, again, this arbitrary thing that happened quickly. But what's also important from these data that, again, are done across several studies with different aged babies and over different longitudinal periods is that there are increases, right? There are increases in how long the memory lasts with age. So one big difference is that even if a 9-month-old can form a long-term memory, 1 month is very different from remembering it for a year, right? You bring back the 9-month-old a year later, they're not going to remember. But you bring back a 20-month-old, and they will, okay? So this is a very robust finding in development, which is the increase of the time that things last in long-term memory over, the first and into the second year of life. So what it does shows you is that one possibility here is that these long-term memories are being formed, but they just don't last that long, right? That's a possibility that these data suggest. Okay. So we do find that they form memories, but there is developmental change, as I said, in how long they last. But again, the other question is, what kind of memories are these, right? Are these the kinds of memories that older children are also forming? And if not, how do they differ, right? And should that matter when we're thinking about infantile amnesia? So one possibility is that even if a 20-month-old is showing evidence of maintaining those memories for a year, are those implicit memories and implicit memories alone and not explicit, which are the ones that we typically find we have amnesia for, right? Those amnesia, infantile amnesia. The more explicit memories related to things like episodic memory, your birthday parties, and so on. Okay, so how do we test that? But before we do that though, that reinforcement paradigm I showed you, do you think that that's kind of a more implicit memory than an explicit one? Probably, right? Implicit insofar as we talked about more procedural things that are more coded in the body, things like tying your shoe, knowing how to use a spoon, right? So maybe we're talking about something that is more implicit in memory, implicit in nature. Yeah.
I would maybe disagree
How come?
because episodic memory is the context in which something is happening and like whatever is taking place, and the fact that they're remembering it in the context of that lab that they're being brought back to, they're remembering the event that took place.
Maybe. That's possible. You're assuming that we didn't try this at home and the baby didn't do it there also, right? But if you're a good experimenter, you would try to do it more carefully the way you're suggesting, right? Well, you're onto a very good point, which is that if this is only implicit procedural memory, and that's all that babies are capable of, then you shouldn't see context-based effects, right? What do we mean by that? Declarative memory, explicit memories, are known to be context-dependent. This is a very important signature. So the idea is, if you can show context specificity in some of these reinforcement learning cases that they did with babies, then maybe they're not entirely implicit, right? And maybe there is a possibility there that they can also form these more explicit memories. Okay, but what do I mean by context-specific memory? So the classic experiment, I love this experiment. It was so simple, right? They took participants and they had them memorize lists of words, right? Memory tests, memory experiments love doing this sort of thing. Here's a long list of words, related or unrelated, it can vary. Spend some time remembering them, and then I give you a memory test, right? Participants hate those because there's a lot of pressure, but that's typically how it's done. Okay, here was the variant that was done with this classic paradigm initially, right, to show the context specificity. So you take one group of participants and you have them learn the lists while they're underwater. They took them out and they went scuba diving, presented them with some lists, and then they had them try to memorize the lists. The other group of participants was up top on the sandy beach, memorizing the list of words, okay? And so then the manipulation, in addition to where you do the learning, is where you get tested. So for the participants who learned underwater, they were either tested again underwater or on the beach, and the participants on the beach were either tested on the beach underwater, right? Does that make sense? So if there's context specificity, where would you show better recall for those lists? Yeah.
If you're tested in the same place you memorized them.
That's right. So better performance here and better performance here. And that's exactly what they find over and over again. Again, this is a really robust finding, right? Yeah.
So should I only study for this class and this class?
Yeah.
Should I do better?
You do better. Well, I don't know how much better. If you're already doing great, you're fine, right? There's not going to be much improvement, but that's the logic, right? Always try to recall where you... Now, the challenge with this, okay, so you'll do better on the test. But there is a consequence to this that's not always great. Any ideas? It's not going to generalize, right? If you want to do well in this course, only study here. And you'll do great because you'll remember better in the classroom when you're taking the exam. And in fact, given that the exam is being given on the computer, you should probably stick to studying on your computer too, right? And not using hard copies or printouts, right? That would be the idea. Keep it as close as possible. The caveat is it doesn't generalize well, right? For information, learning to generalize better, you want the learning to be more variable, right? You want to be studying here, you want to be studying at home, you want to be studying at Starbucks, right? So ideally, in that case, the learning will be less context specific and will carry forward, right? So if you want to carry forward what you've learned in this course and not have term memory, then don't just study here, right? Go and think about cognitive development everywhere, not just in this classroom, right? So like I said, there's one way to do better in the class and on the exam, and there's another way to do better in life if you want to remember cognitive development. But that's sort of the pro and the con, right? And this, so I'll share a little bit to show you just how dedicated I was as a student. I was actually not a psychology major, but I did learn about this context specificity in another class I was taking. And I thought it was great, right? I'm going to do better on the exam because I'm going to study. And I'm gonna take the test, I'm gonna plan to take the test the way that I studied. So I was staying up very late. Okay, don't judge me while I tell this story. I was staying up very late, not abiding by my own advice of saying go to bed so you can consolidate. I hadn't learned that part, right? But I was staying up very late to remember everything, to do well on the exam. And I needed coffee because I was staying up, so I'm drinking lots of coffee. If you know me, you know that I hate black coffee. I've always hated black coffee. I need lots of cream in my coffee, right? People often joke, do you want some coffee with your cream? Because I like it very creamy. So I need the coffee, ran out of cream, no more milk or half and half to add. So I found Bailey's Irish Cream. So I put a little Bailey's Irish Cream in my coffee. Tasted great, right? By the end of the night, I was a little loopy, but I was up and studying, right? So here's what happened. The next day when I went to take the test, which I think was, I don't know, early afternoon, I'm on my way to the exam with some friends, and I need some coffee to take to the exam. Now here's the conundrum. Do I have my normal coffee with milk or cream? Or do I grab the Baileys to put back in my coffee so that I have context specificity? I did the latter, did great, right? But in any case, I know, I'm not, again, this is optimal. This is optimal, right? If I had had too much Baileys, then I probably wouldn't have done well on the exam, right? So you can't be drunk. So that's the idea, right? And this is shown a lot, again, across studies, that context specificity is really helpful for retrieval in particular. So now we're talking about the retrieval of these memories, not necessarily the encoding, right? There's going to be presumably no difference in terms of encoding whether you're learning underwater or on the beach. Unless, of course, you're more familiar with one of these environments. But the difference here in context specificity is with respect to the retrieval. That you need the same context to help retrieve those memories. People often also talk about this as cueing memory, right? Some association that allows you to pull and retrieve that memory. Okay, so going back to the issue of the reinforcement learning with the ribbon and the crib, what if you do the same to the babies? Not the Irish cream part, right? You bring them to the lab. This time you manipulate the context in an experimental way. So what they ended up doing is that, and again, it's important because it suggests that the memory is not strictly implicit. It may have this more explicit declarative characteristic to it. So the way they did it was you would bring the baby into the lab. You saw the crib and how it had those, it had kind of blankets or wallpaper-like things on the sides. So they manipulated that, right? So the baby either learned about the kicking and the ribbon when those blankets matched, right? So if you were learning in a sort of crib that's covered in yellow polka dots, you would then bring the baby back and test the baby in the crib with the yellow polka dots or a new surrounding. And they find a match where, again, there is an advantage if the context aligns, okay? So that suggests, and that's not typical for implicit memories, right? Or procedural memories. You can ride a bike, whether it's your bike or someone else's bike, even after a long period, right? That memory stays, and it doesn't matter what bike it is. Doesn't matter what the context is. It's the declarative stuff that seems to have an advantage when it comes to context and alignment. Yeah.
So in this case, they tested the amount of kicking.
That's right.
Depending on if they were in the same crib or a different crib.
Yeah. And the same or different crib is just varied depending on the color that's surrounding it, so it looks like different wallpaper or paint. So yeah, they kicked more if they learned in the yellow polka dot crib. After the 9-month-old, after a 1 month delay, kicks more if he's tested on in the crib with the yellow polka dots. than if the crib is, you know, surrounded by different colored and patterned blankets. So that's the manipulation you wanted, and that's what you get here, to again suggest that maybe that memory, even though it seems very implicit and procedural, may be more explicit than we originally thought. So it suggests that babies can even form some of those more explicit memories, okay? I probably should have stopped the recording when I talked about my Bailey's Irish Cream. I'll go back and get rid of that. Okay. So here's the other issue. If babies can form memories, again, in this arbitrary case, and these memories are somewhat declarative or seem that they can be declarative in nature, more explicit, then why aren't they, or why are we having infantile amnesia when it comes to stuff that we consider explicit and more declarative, right? Why can't we access, you know, memories for our first birthday party, right? Or the first time as an infant you went to the doctor's office. Why can't we access those memories? So one possibility that people have raised is that maybe those memories, even if they're more declarative in nature, are strictly semantic, right? That the problems here in terms of being able to access early memories are specifically with respect to the episodic memory being problematic, right? And again, when I ask you what your first memory is, it tends to be something that's episodic, but those are the memories you can't seem to access before 3 or 4 years of age. So maybe either, right, babies are not forming episodic memories before that period, so that's one possibility. What was the other possibility I mentioned? They might be forming them, but you can't access them, right? Maybe there is a difference in the type of code that you form. And that's where people are kind of leaning these days. They're suggesting that episodic memory is very dependent on, I've already mentioned language and narrative as impacting our episodic memories, we know that. And the youngest babies are not going to be verbal, so there has to be a mismatch. The other part of this is that episodic memory seems to be really dependent on a sense of self, and what people talk about as, you know, identity, where you're different from, you know, your sibling and other people. You can sort of understand your place in the world. I did say a few classes ago that this sense starts to develop somewhat early, like when the baby looks at the video where the socks in the video don't align with how the baby is moving. But that was but that's something I said was very primitive, right? It was very much based on the body and not who you are as a person, right? Who you are as, you know, a gender in the world, for example. This happens later. And our episodic memories are very much tied to identity. And because identity is also, and sense of self is developing later, this may be where some of that mismatch comes in, right? So these are some of the possibilities. I also said that they're more linguistic. Okay, any questions about all of this? Yeah.
Is it possible that we're forming these memories and they're encoded similarly in all of that, but then it just wasn't like evolutionarily beneficial to us to have those episodic memories, and so we just developed to sort of drop them? Or is that not really how?
I mean, I don't know. You know, whenever we make evolutionary arguments, they're just so stories for the most part, right? They're very post hoc. Maybe we can make an evolutionary argument. Do you have an idea? Like, why would it be bad to have early memories? Early memories of, I mean, presumably some of those are going to be negative, and maybe we don't want those, a la Freud. But some of them are going to be pleasant, right? Trying certain foods for the first time, you know, a baby eating their first spoonful of ice cream, getting kind of giddy, or, playing with a pet for the first time again as an infant and having a fun time. Are there reasons not to have that, do you think?
Maybe it's not.
I don't know, right? I mean, again, maybe. So more with non-human animals, particularly with rats, looking at things like fear conditioning and learning, whether certain foods are harmful. And you want to taste something, it tastes bad, and you don't want to go back to it because it's potentially poisonous or something like that. Maybe one idea could be, from an evolutionary perspective, that's more important. Having things that are maybe sort of more semantic in nature, dedicate more of your resources to that, maybe. That's a possibility. But again, if it's also very dependent on this understanding of who you are and yourself and identity, then it's just going to be later to develop as a consequence, because that takes a while to build up as well. Any other questions? Okay, I want to talk a little bit about another kind of memory. Do I have this? Yeah, okay. So let's talk about working memory. Working memory, remember I said, was very active. This is considered very conscious also, where information is being processed, where oftentimes you're rehearsing something to keep it in mind so that it can eventually get into longer term memory. It's characterized by its sort of limited size. It's great because, again, it allows us to think about things in our minds, to manipulate information, to work on information, to bring information from long-term memory into working memory so we could think about it, but it's very limited. Yeah.
Wait, the 7 plus or minus 2 is like seconds?
This is items. So this is kind of a magic number in psychology. One of the sort of first early findings in relation to memory, this idea that working memory was characterized by this thing. I think the original paper said the magic number 7, and then they ended adding plus or minus 2, right? So it's a rough estimate. But the idea here is that in general, across people, the average number of items you can keep in mind is 7, plus or minus 2. Average. Now, of course, there's going to be a normal distribution that surrounds that, and some people may have more than that, and other people a lot less. Okay, but that's the average. Okay. But you can also ask, that seems small. That doesn't seem ideal, right, given everything that we think about and all of the stuff that we can have in our minds. So people try to flesh this idea out and have tried to flesh this idea out of what 7 and what these units actually mean. So here's how you do it. Okay, I'm going to present you with a series of numbers. There's no cheating. Don't write anything down. I'm going to present it to you, and then I want you to recall the numbers I present to you, okay? I'm even going to put the numbers up on screen to help you so that you can do better. Okay. 4, 1, 6, 8, 2, 1, 1, 6, 9, 6, 3, 5, 4. How many can you remember? Who wants to do it? Go for it.
4, 1, 3, 8, 6, 1, 1.
No. Sorry, but that's okay. Anyone else? Go for it.
4, 1, 6, 8, 2, 1, 1, 6, 9. That's all.
Oh,
6 3 after that.
not bad. Okay. Rehearsal. You had a little more time to rehearse. You came right out of the bat without having rehearsed. I'll give it to you. Okay. That seemed pretty hard, right? I think. A lot of numbers. Okay, let me try another one. Let's see if you can do better. The 7 could have been each of the letters, right? So on average, maybe you can remember C, the N, N, the C, I, A, J. Maybe you remember those, right? If that was just what was being treated as the unit, the individual letter. But in this case, that's not what's being treated as the unit. It's the CNN, CIA, JFK, right? So now you're building up potentially being able to have 7 plus or minus 2 of these, right? Which again expands the amount of information in your working memory greatly in terms of the individual items. Is that clear? Okay, but we've already said, does it matter if you don't know what CNN means or CIA? Yes, very much so. You can only do this chunking if you know what these things correspond to. You can only do the chunking for the 416 I did, right? Because you happen to know what the area code is, right? It does depend on the semantic knowledge you have for these things. Okay, so then maybe not surprisingly, this is the developmental trajectory, whereby that 7 plus or minus 2 comes up in late adolescence, early adulthood. We know the 7 plus or minus 2 from years of testing college students in these psychology experiments, right? But that's what we're sort of building up to. That's the pinnacle. It doesn't start that way. There is going to be a little decline also into old age, unfortunately, which may be unrelated to the increase that you get early on, right? So based on what we said before, what is accounting for some of this change, right? Some of it, even though it seems like we're doing it at the individual unit, is going to have to be semantically related, right? The idea that the more knowledge you have, the more associations you make, the more chunks you're going to be able to access. So that's one possibility that people have talked about. Another possibility is rehearsal. We just get better at using rehearsal as a strategy, right? So if I bring a 5-year-old into the lab and I say, I want you to remember, right, the numbers, 416, 821, 1696, they're gonna like maybe just listen. I'll take it away, and then I'll say, let's remember, and they didn't do anything in the meantime. They don't even know that rehearsal is a thing. You bring an adult into the lab, right, and you start going, 416, 821, 1696, 416, 821, right? So that strategy doesn't even become known to children until they start to get to be 6 or 7 years of age. And then there's also just attention in terms of how much you can focus to be able to take in and maintain that information. We think that these are explanations for the increase. Like I said, it might be separate in terms of the decrease that happens later in old age, but in older age. But the increase is pretty significant and related to these different factors. Okay. So we're talking about increasing the amount of information you have in working memory in terms of chunking and rehearsal. There's one way to really impact how much you can keep in working memory. Anxiety. If you are anxious, it is so bad for working memory. It kills working memory. Don't get anxious if you need to remember someone's phone number. Why is that? What does anxiety do you think?
It produces stress hormones that helps protect you.
But what does that do to working memory? That's a possibility. So maybe it interferes with the encoding stuff that's happening in working memory, though it's already been encoded. That's how it got into working memory. So now you're working on it. So maybe not totally the encoding thing. Yeah.
It takes part of your capacity. Like if it's 8, it takes like 3 or 4 because you're like consciously thinking about something else. Like you're worried about it. So
Yeah, that's exactly right. So what do you do when you're anxious? One thing that we know people do is they ruminate. I'm really worried about this thing, right? This thing's really stressing me out. When you're thinking about that, that's working memory. Dealing with things and thinking about things you probably don't want it to be dealing and thinking about, right? Because it's actually creating it's maintaining your anxiety. So when anxiety disrupts working memory, right, if you're too anxious on a test and you're trying to solve some math problem that you need your working memory for, it impacts the resources available. It takes away from them because the working memory you need to be solving the problem is now ruminating over how you can't solve the problem, basically. So that's what happens, right? That's why in all of these experiments showing that anxiety affects memory and working memory in particular, it's because it is taking up those valuable 7 ± 2 resources that you need to be able to solve the problem and whatnot. Okay. And you will see this some more when we talk next time about spatial cognition. There's a lot of spatial anxiety out in the world about how, well, maybe there's less about navigation these days because you can always pull up your GPS, right? But when GPS didn't exist, people would get super anxious about going somewhere because what if you get lost, right? How do you find your way out? Not being trapped, right? I mean, how do you find your way back? That was very anxiety-provoking. Now I don't think we see a lot of that kind of spatial anxiety, but we will see some other kind of spatial anxiety that can affect working memory, because remember, some working memory can be visual spatial in nature, right? Okay. I want to return to this slide. Because I initially said that sensory and memory can go into working memory, which can then get into long-term memory and back. Some people have recently been asking whether sensory memory can make its way into long-term memory directly. It bypasses working memory, which is not something we ever thought was possible, right? So Tim Brady and some other folks at UCSD started doing this kind of work to ask, are there at least some cases in which you see things in the world, you're not actively rehearsing them, right? You're not actively trying to keep them in mind, and yet, a week later, you still remember what that thing looked like, or something like that, right? So it seemed like it could be possible, but it hadn't really been tested. So here's a way that they tested it with adults and school-aged kids. They would bring people into the lab, they would show them items like this. They would show them a lot of these items, 2,500, massive amounts. They don't tell them anything, they just are like, okay, you're gonna see a slideshow. And it's massively boring, right? Even though it's not hard, but you're just seeing these images, and you're not told to do anything. You're just told you're gonna watch a slideshow. Maybe they might play some music in the background and say, here, don't fall asleep, and they'll play your favorite song, right? So you see these images, they're presented for about 3 seconds each, and then unbeknownst to you, they say, okay, now we're gonna do a memory test. People hate that. So they'll say something like, at least the memory test is somewhat easier because it's not recall. They're not telling you to recall and reproduce all the items that you saw. They're doing a recognition test, like you do in multiple choice. Did you see this one or that one? Okay. So how many did I say they do? About 3,500 of those? Yeah, about 3,500 items. Then after a few minutes, sometimes after a few hours, you do this test. Okay, what happens? So I'm actually going to do a little test on you. I want you to guess. How accurate do you think people are? 60 to 70%, 70 to 80, 80 to 90, over 90%. What do you think? How do you think you would do on a test like that? 3,500 objects. Which one did you see?
Do you see all of them?
All of them, one at a time. And you sit there, 3 seconds each. And then you do the test. How do you think you would score? Take a guess. 90? Who said 90? Look at you! Anybody else think 90? Okay, very good. actually people are 93% correct. It's crazy how good they do, right? And it's nice because few people are that confident, right? You are not told to remember those items, right? You had no reason to try. Even if you did, you could imagine how well would you really do, right? Trying to keep all of those in mind. And yet, just being presented with these passively, you form this longish term memory, right? I don't know if this lasts years, probably not, but it lasts at least a few hours and a couple of weeks. It's pretty amazing. Starting at 5 and 6 years of age, you already get this effect. Okay, but maybe this is too easy. We didn't know it was this easy, but we found out it's too easy. Can we make it harder? So they did make it harder. And now, it's not recall, but suppose you did see one of these images be the hot air balloon. Now they want you to say exactly what the hot air balloon looked like. Was it this one or that one? Guess what? Almost no difference. People are still really great. This was the toughest test they did. I could not believe it. So they did this one, where you would have seen one of these images, and the only difference, right, is whether the flag is up or not. People can still do it. So this is evidence that, remember that sensory memory I said was kind of massive? It's also highly detailed. And it can make its way, I said it initially, it was adaptive to get rid of that information, right? We don't want this information to be carrying over as you go into different rooms and you're remembering all these previous items, visual or auditory. But in some cases, it does last longer, and it's actually very unconscious. You weren't even consciously working these things out in working memory. So this is a pretty amazing capacity that we have. This has been mostly done in vision. For anyone who's wondering whether it's also in echoic auditory memory, I don't know. I don't know how much it's been tried. It would be a good question. But in vision, it's lasting a really long time, and the capacity is big and detailed, which is pretty cool. Okay. Just quickly, I want to wrap up by saying that part of the reason, we haven't said much about why long-term memory lasts as long as it does. One reason it may last as long as it does is long-term memory is inherently organized, right? So in our minds, we don't just have random facts floating around, right? The way that information is mentally organized is it is organized according to categories, semantic relations, and so on. And we know that memories are organized like this. For example, your memory, when you're thinking of a school bus, you have associations between the school, the bus, the children, and so on that are clustered together more. And we know this from behavioral experiments. You don't have to do neuroimaging with these experiments. You know these from behavioral experiments because you are better able to retrieve and recall information within the separate clusters that you may have in your mind, right? So if you bring people into the... That's right. So exactly. So apply what you're saying to something like this, right? So if you have associations where you're remembering items like couch and chair, and then I say, hey, when I gave you that list, did I also say pillow? You're more likely to say yes, right? Because maybe there's I don't know, maybe pillow's not a good one. Stool, whatever, another kind of chair, right? You're more likely to falsely remember that. You're more likely to falsely remember cat or mouse if what you have organized is dog and rat, right? So the good of this organization is it maintains our memories better, it allows for longer duration, it allows for more information to be nicely organized in your mind, but the bad is that it can lead to more errors, and you can have what people call false memories. Practically, this has become a very researched area because people, will talk about or be concerned by the possibility of memories being implanted or false memories that can have very traumatic consequences on other people's lives if you misremember abuse, for example, by a parent or an adult because of these false memories being a possibility. So here's a case where we get a nice intersection between psychology and law, and there are a lot of people working in this space trying to understand things like eyewitness testimony in the courtroom when it's a kid who's the witness, right? Should we believe the kid as much as we believe an adult? Are their memories as good? Are they more susceptible to false memories, right? So here's what I want you guys to guess now based on what I've said. We know what long-term memories are like. We know that that organization might lead to false memories. Do you think that kids have more false memories than adults? Or the reverse? Yeah.
I think adults have more false memories because they have more in their memory and more experience to mess up.
More of those associations, right? That can lead to. This is completely opposite to what people initially thought, right? People initially thought that kids were highly susceptible. You would never want them to be a witness. Not that it's fun to be a witness, and I'm not saying we should be having kids serve as witnesses all the time, right? But the idea that they were more susceptible to these false memories is totally the opposite of what the research finds, okay? So what's really cool about this research is that children are actually less susceptible. By 4 years, at least some of their long-term memory is as detailed as that of adults, right? So when they remember something, like if a child and adult both remember the man who came into the store that then stole something, they will likely remember the details of that person at the same level, okay? So by 4 years of age, children's long-term memories are as detailed in some respects as adults. But because they have less experience with the world and less knowledge about the world, they're making fewer semantic associations, right? That organization is less complex. In that way, we think that it leads to less false memories because they're not as likely to recruit some of this additional stuff that they haven't built up yet, right? So again, very, very opposite to what people initially expected, given differences between children and adults. The differences in, like I said, those semantic associations actually somewhat protects you from some of those false memories. And all these stories you would hear about in terms of, you know, you can implant almost anything in like a kid's mind, for example, is simply not true. Right? It's actually very hard to implant false memories in a kid, right? To tell them that they went to the shopping mall with their parents and they ran into like Bugs Bunny or some other character. Don't you remember that? You should remember that. Of course he was there. That doesn't happen as readily as people thought, right? So I think that's actually a really interesting sort of practical implication of all of this stuff. Okay. Any questions about all of this? Okay, I'm going to leave memory here, and we can come back to a little bit of this when I do the review, and if there are any other follow-up questions, we can do a little bit more of that. I just want to leave you with the next topic and what we're going to be doing. We're going to be studying the development of spatial cognition, and as part of this, we're going to talk about some gender differences. I'm highlighting gender differences here, because we have talked about this a little bit in the past when we talked about language. Remember the idea that girls had a bit of an advantage early on when it came to vocabulary, and we think that's because of their slightly more advanced social pragmatic understanding. I also said that boys catch up, right? That even though there's an early advantage, eventually there aren't gender differences. This is a case where gender differences begin early in life on some tasks, and not only are they sustained, they sometimes get larger. In psychology, we don't think of gender differences the way we do biologically related differences, right? The idea that on average men are taller than women, that's a true thing, right? People don't deny that. The idea that maybe boys and men could be better at certain spatial tests than women and girls sounds completely bizarre. Why would that be, right? What would be the biological basis? There likely isn't one, right? So this is what we're going to talk about here, which is that there are certain gender differences that are both biological and environmental in nature. And understanding those is not a bad thing. Understanding those is a good thing, especially if we want to minimize them, right? And especially if we want to know exactly where those differences lie and where they don't. There's a lot of confusion out there about what kinds of gender differences, what kinds of spatial abilities show gender differences and which don't, and so on. So we're going to talk about some of these things. I'm just going to mention that this topic is going to be divided into two types of spatial cognition. The first one is navigation, and I'm saying unaided here because I don't care how you navigate with your GPS. That's not hard, right? You can pretty much be brain dead. I want to know how you navigate when I take your phone away, right? And I force you to go something, right? Yeah, no, it's sad. It's very hard. So we're going to talk about how we do that. I also want to talk about something that's more visual spatial in nature, a kind of spatial ability that people love to study, that people love to use to measure how smart you are, right? These kinds of tests show up on IQ tests, right? This mental rotation. So we're going to talk about that next class. Before you go, I did this to you the last time for one of our classes. One quick test. Close your eyes. I can see all of you. Okay, now I want you to point northwest. Okay, open your eyes and look around. No agreement. Okay, close your eyes again. Close your eyes again. I want you to point to Peavine parking lot. Open your eyes. Wow, look at you guys. Okay. By the way, that was northwest. It is that way. Yeah, it's Peavine. Yeah. So now, I'm just going to say, two types of spatial information. One you were really good at, where's Peavine? We'll talk about what that is next time. It's called a landmark. One of which you were pretty bad at, which is cardinal direction, northwest, right?